Hi, Aric. Good evening. How are you?
Good. How are you, Vera?
Very good. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today, all the way from Basel to Shanghai. I wanted to start
Thank you.
talking to you about the present moment that we're living in, which I feel like you've experienced
Oh
it.
God, that.
Yeah. I feel like every talk these days starts like that. But I do think you have kind of an interesting perspective on the situation, made more interesting by the fact that you sort of lived the onset of this pandemic in a different way than most of us. You were in the US when things sort of really took off in China, and the lockdown was enforced in China. And then when things got really crazy in Western Europe and then the US, you were back in China, where you are right now in Shanghai. And I feel like when we see what Shanghai looks like right now, it just feels like it's light years ahead from where we are now here in Switzerland. I wonder if you could just sort of comment on your experience of the last 7 months, more or less.
Sure. Well, I have to admit, this is one of the rare cases in which I was definitely ahead of the curve, perhaps. Like a lot of people, I was one of those types who was on the road a lot pre-pandemic. And I was in China in January, just as news started trickling out about this, what was then a still relatively small outbreak in Wuhan. And from there, the next 3 months were a bit of an odyssey, as, like you said, I was always seemingly a half step ahead of the pandemic. For various reasons, I was off from China. I was in India and the Middle East, and then Europe, and then the U.S. Like always, right as the the pandemic was taking hold in those places, and so I really it was a bit of an odyssey.
Mm-hmm.
Of course. Like every day was required, recalculating routes and plans. I spent so much time with the airlines. I was tested twice in Hong Kong. Towards the end, I was in Hong Kong before coming back to Shanghai, just in the nick of time on the last day that foreign passport holders, I'm a U.S. citizen, were allowed back. And but in Hong Kong, I suddenly developed a mild fever and a little bit of a cough, and I was like, oh no, I should really get tested. So I spent a night in isolation in the hospital. It was negative, thankfully. I mean, it was just a regular cold or flu. Those still exist. I mean, I did 2 home quarantines. I've been released since mid-April, and I have to say, at this point, I am in touch almost pretty much daily with people in other parts of the world, and as you say, Shanghai, especially right now, is a bit of a parallel universe because the virus has been pretty under control for quite a few months now, probably since around March. It's a city of 25 million people. I think there have only been about 700, 800 confirmed cases, maybe around 10 deaths.
Wow.
And almost all of that was early on. And so since I've been out of quarantine in April, I mean, there's been no social distancing anywhere.
Yeah.
People still wear face masks, but less and less. There are trade shows going on now. I've been at events for 1,000 people.
Yeah, I saw some fashion shows, like big brands are using Shanghai as kind of a platform to launch either new collections or new projects. It seems like sort of the design, part of the design world, let's say, sort of transferred itself to China and said, okay, let's just take anchor here in Shanghai. How do you experience it right now? Is it like, I mean, at least I've seen 2 major fashion brands do presentations very recently in Shanghai, and I think you also attended those kinds of events.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really as if it's almost as if nothing ever happened. I mean, the people are vigilant. You are still aware that we are in the situation, but like that's I was on we're sort of talking about the future here, and I was actually on another Zoom talk or virtual talk last Friday, about the future of the city, and I think it bears sort of mentioning at least that a lot of predictions are being made, and certainly in Shanghai, in China, we're definitely aware that things can take a turn for the worse at any moment, and there will very likely be some kind of second wave or flare up, and so on. But different places are experiencing the pandemic in different ways and on different timelines. So it's when we talk about the future of design post-pandemic, it's very hard to sort of generalize because here, for better or worse, and probably for better and worse, it's been pretty much business as usual, as far as I can see so far.
So far, yeah. Well, unfortunately, this year we didn't have the opportunity to see each other in Basel during Art Basel because, as we all know, this was canceled, first postponed and then eventually canceled. And your work at Design Miami also involved thinking of another future, or at least a reaction to this, to these events. How is it that Design Miami reacted? I mean, I feel like, thinking retrospectively, the fact that you started anchoring the exhibitions that you did both last year in Basel and December in Miami around the topics of these elements, it feels like a little bit prescient of the current crisis moment. I wonder how did you guys decide to react once you saw that things were just really not going to be able to materialize physically here in Basel?
Yeah, well, speaking of prescience, I think a lot of us have been unknowingly prescient recently. No, I mean, like, also just in December, I opened a show in Tel Aviv called State of Extremes. Yes. And everyone was saying how prescient that was, but it's not really about prescience. I think it really more comes down to the basic fact that the pandemic, as a lot of people have been saying, isn't necessarily changing the world so much as it is accelerating processes that were already underway. So, it's not that we were prescient; it's just that we were bringing things up that were happening, and the pandemic just amplified them and sped them up. So it seems prescient. I mean, with Design Miami, of course. We were really disappointed. Everyone was very disappointed that June in Basel was canceled, not just for the financial, reasons, but also I think we were genuinely looking forward to it. We had some great stuff planned, and it really was a shame. Like, as with everyone who's had events canceled, it was a real shame that we couldn't do it. But in other ways. Again, going back to this idea of the pandemic accelerating things, we had already been revisiting the fair and the future of the fair. I think it's no secret that pre-pandemic there were already a lot of questions about fair fatigue and in ways in which the fair model could and maybe should adapt and evolve and change, and we were already thinking about those, and now we've had the chance to accelerate those plans as well. So one of the obvious things, and we're certainly not alone in this, is that we have relaunched the website with a much more robust, with much more robust content, as well as an e-commerce selling platform, and also. We had been working on a new format called Design Miami Podium. The idea being, instead of making everyone come to, just two sort of motherships all the time. I mean, not everyone can come, and especially if you want to reach new audiences and also engage new ideas and new design communities, as well as collector and patron and cultural communities in different places. Sometimes you have to go to them, and so we were going to. Develop these smaller, lighter, leaner, meaner, curated selling exhibitions that we could take to different cities, working with local partners. And in fact, we had pretty much confirmed plans to do our first one in Hong Kong this March. before Art Basel Hong Kong was canceled. But now we'll be doing our first one, our first podium this December in Miami, because of course Art Basel in Miami has already announced its cancellation. Design Miami being a Miami, a Miami event where we're moving forward, though of course in a different, smaller, leaner, meaner, socially distanced format. So we'll be going back to the Miami Design District, which is where the fair started 15 years ago, and we'll be showing so for a lot of galleries that can't show for different reasons, they can participate in this curated exhibition, which will be themed. Speaking of themes, America.
Oh, wow! In December, that seems like an important topic. Wow. Okay. That's going to be that's going to be very interesting to see. But I think I want to talk about two things that you just alluded to. Like the first one was this. This issue of access, right? Like the system that we and by we I mean sort of this design world that goes to fairs and biennials and exhibitions and is sort of like traveling, has a very shameful carbon footprint and so on. These people can go to certain places and can have access to a certain kind of conversations, exhibitions, museums, and so on. And many other people cannot. And the fact that everybody during the pandemic turned to the digital more or less haphazardly, more or less in a rush, more or less professionally, really allowed a lot of people to have access to this content, which I think is its own sort of double-edged sword. On the one hand, please no more Zoom calls. On the other hand, oh wow, fantastic, it's really there and I can have access to it, right? So that's one thing that I want to talk about. And then the other thing is this turn to the local, right? So every event had to sort of reinvent itself to have a smaller dimension. And I feel like what you were just describing that you were going to be doing in December in Miami is exactly a great example of that. You know, partnering with local institutions, developing a program that's much more maybe tailored to the local scene. Do you want to comment on those two things, maybe? Completely different edges of the spectrum, let's say.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they're different, but not unrelated. You know, going back to this idea of again, speeding up what was already happening. I think there was already a trend towards more localized and regionalized perspectives. As you well know, for Basel in June, we were wanting to work more closely with the design community in Basel and Switzerland. Now, at the same time, it's still a global, interconnected world for now. Although, that seems to be changing a little bit as well. But certainly, I think the digital platform, as you say, does also provide more access. So, if you can kind of find that's your sweet spot where you are able to get the online and offline to work together. That probably the online being global and as borderless as possible, and the offline being more rooted in its physical localities. Then I think that's not a bad forward direction in my mind.
Have you seen any examples that you find particularly interesting right now, or if you have time to access all the programming that's been developed by so many different institutions all over the world, right?
No, I mean, I think it's really amazing how everyone has just sort of mobilized, after all this happened, right? With this incredible amount of online content, with with designers just churning out proposals and different like initiatives. I mean, people really came together and showed their best sides, in addition to the worst sides of humanity that we also saw. But I mean, I think there have been a lot of really great initiatives. I'm sort of more waiting for the technology to develop, right? Because a lot of the sort of platforms that we use, we're not developed for a lot of the kind of formats, or to substitute for the kinds of things that they're substituting for. So, for example, even like online conferences, I mean, large gatherings of people with multiple speakers. I mean, it's right now it is still very kind of almost improvised, but
yeah, totally.
But I know that there are. I've seen some demos lately of new platforms that could create much more interesting experiences online.
Mm-mm. I mean, another thing that has changed is because we've sort of been forced to stay in place. A lot of this sort of like shipping of things, producing of things, sourcing of specific materials. I mean, designers love to work with experiment and explore. There's a lot of material exploration happening. And I just wonder about maybe a certain loss of a physicality that we are going towards, of course people are still still been making chairs and so on, and tables and lamps and so on, but I feel like perhaps we've sort of arrived to a certain moment where people are questioning more than ever. I mean, as you say, the great sort of this pandemic sort of made things clear in a very sort of strong, stark light, and they were already there, like you say, but now we sort of took away the tablecloth, and you can see the sort of the stark reality just underneath, right? I feel like there's the danger of a certain lack of physicality that maybe I've experienced just because I haven't been seeing designers making that many things. But on the other hand, you've had a huge response of designers like, for example, Unfold in Antwerp. They've been working to develop all these like PPE and sort of distribute it all around Belgium and I think also south of the Netherlands, if I'm not wrong. I mean, there have been those immediate reactions, let's say, to very specific and real problems caused by the pandemic itself. In this case, the scarcity of medical protective equipment. But I just wonder, like, I haven't seen much more than that, and I wonder this great sort of reckoning that we are all having with ourselves and with the profession that we're engaged in. I also wonder how that can materialize. I know that I don't like to speculate about the future, because I feel like you just said, like, this pandemic is happening in different timelines, different places. We can't generalize. We can't say this is how the design world is going to look like. But I wonder, I mean, have you observed any other reactions that also deal or engage more with the physical realm, or are we just going to depart towards a very conceptual turn for the discipline, where we are also not going to produce as much because we're sort of confronted with the realities of, on the one hand, the pandemic, on the other hand, climate crisis, and so on? Like, what do you think about these things?
Well, I'm going to say something in this context that might be a little provocative, which is I hope we don't produce as much after this, because we don't need as much as we're producing now. That doesn't mean that doesn't marginalize the importance of design. In fact, I think if anything, it emphasizes the importance of design, because design is not just about making physical stuff, but it's about kind of reimagining how we do things, right? And that often involves physical stuff, whether it's designing more physical stuff or designing ways to reduce the amount of physical stuff that we produce. Now, I think, again, going back to this idea of acceleration for better and worse. We know on the worst side, we're aware of what the pandemic has accelerated. On the better side, hopefully, it has also accelerated the momentum that was already there to sort of address the sort of broader issues of climate change, sustainability in general, social equality, things like that that we were all looking at, but have also come into stark relief, but also now maybe are our collective efforts can be, sort of amplified there as well. I mean, my fear is that the pandemic, as serious as it is, and I'm not trying to minimize it by any means, but it's doing a lot of damage, and a lot of people are suffering. But the pandemic itself will go away, at some point, in some form or another. It will go. It shall pass. But what will not go away are these bigger issues that it has brought to starker relief, and into starker relief. And we shouldn't take our eye off that ball. I mean, I'm not a policymaker or an economist by any means, but early on, when governments around the world were unleashing these untold trillions of dollars that somehow came out of nowhere in economic aid, much of which actually went to support, in many cases, people who didn't need it, large corporations and so on and so forth. I mean, it's good that people did need help, and a lot of people were helped by that. But I was kind of like, couldn't we do this to address climate change? I mean, hasn't that been the sort of sticking point? Is that it's going to cost too much, and we don't have the financial resources or whatnot? Suddenly, these trillions and trillions of dollars emerge from thin air.
It just sort of manifested, right? You were like, they were not there before, but here we are.
And you're almost like, hello, where did that come from? I'm not buying your excuses anymore that we can't pay for.
I mean, it's of course a matter of political will, of economical will. I mean, but I mean, like, can design and the design world do anything else other than feel impotent in face of these challenges? I mean, I personally believe not. And exactly like you said, like, keeping the eye on these sort of major issues of our time is something that cannot go away. Like, I feel like designers should not be able to go back when the pandemic, goes away, and when we maybe arrive to a different but certainly more comfortable moment around the planet, where we can expect to maybe have social interactions again, or we can expect maybe to sort of move freely again, maybe not take so many flights as before. But, I feel like there still will be these concerns. Like, designers still have to focus on these concerns. And I am not sure that the way to do it is to reinvent the discipline, or to use maybe what the discipline has given us or taught us to go and try to intervene at that political level, at that economic level. What do you think?
Yeah, again, these questions about what design is and what design's role is, we're also here before the pandemic, and and have just been accentuated by it. And I think our discipline has been in this sort of soul-searching period for a while, and that is continuing. And of course, I don't have the magic answer for what design not just as a profession, but as a calling, what that looks like down the road. But I think, for the things that make design, the things that we love about design and that made it relevant are not going to go away, right? I mean, physicality is not going to go away. Totally. We are, but also, different methodologies of thinking, and also value systems, which I think are as integral to design, as making and production are. Those aren't going to go away either. And I think if there's anything that really characterizes design and designers, it's the sort of ingenuity and flexibility and adaptability that is wired into our collective brains or minds. So, I mean, I don't know exactly what design is going to look like, in 3 or 5 or 10 years, but I have no doubt that it's going to be relevant. Now, in terms of just to kind of come back to the issue of the bigger issues, and also what roles we can play in addressing those as individuals versus sort of collectives, or as the collective. You mentioned travel and planes, and I know I'm probably going to not get yelled at, especially with a European audience, because I know what's it called? Is it flight shaming, right? Like I think there's a phenomenon of flight shaming there, and by no means am I saying that we should not all do our part and act more responsibly and reduce our consumption and reduce our carbon footprints. Absolutely, but one thing that's also emerged or was clarified for me during this pandemic was I think a couple of months ago, one of the UN or one of the international energy agencies released some sort of report that said that due to all the sort of shutdowns of the pandemic, the world would reduce its carbon usage or carbon output this year by an estimated 7%.
Wow.
Now, 7% is not nothing,
but still, it's not that much.
You think of like shutting down the entire planet practically, or so it felt.
That's so crazy.
And it also pointed out that we would need to reduce our carbon output every year by 8.5% just to meet the Paris Climate Treaty goals. Now, that tells me that instead of focusing on flight shaming people,
again, here we go. Political will, economic will. There we go.
Yeah,
that's where
maybe those trillions of dollars should have gone to sort of really investing into renewable energy and research and development into and developing carbon taxation systems, whatever.
Totally.
We need to focus on these higher level changes, because whether I take a flight to Beijing this week or not, honestly doesn't make a difference, In
the end, ultimately, that's not what's going to reduce the impact. But I do think that, at least I enjoyed very much this sort of like gallivanting the globe years that we had, and I very much enjoyed meeting you, here and there, when you met somebody, it was always like, okay, when will we see each other again? Which town, which biennial, which fair, And I feel like, I feel very stupid because I feel like that was such a privileged time, and we were also such privileged people, and we didn't really understand how privileged we were, I feel. And this pandemic also showed that this whole system of biennials, fairs, design weeks, such a fragile ecosystem, It completely goes away with 2 months of a disruption of this kind, right? And, that means also that people lose their jobs, entire cities just sort of, invest a lot on that because they expect some sort of economic return and so on. And all of those things have impacted negatively a lot of people's lives. A lot of people have lost their jobs, a lot of people that work in these more like, let's say, precarious, our field is also a precarious one, but precarious fields like production of events, setting up trade shows and so on. For this, I also don't have an answer, but I was just kind of shocked to see how precarious this whole circus that we kept putting on every single year was. And frankly, right now I'm like, I don't care. I kind of don't care about the biennial, and I kind of don't care about the design week, and I just don't care because I don't think that's the way to go. But I know it's a horrible thing to say, and I'm probably going to get shamed for saying this. But I really think that you either use it for sort of a meaningful purpose, or if it's just going to be business as usual, it needs to do something else, to start another kind of conversation. Like the one that I think you were wanting to start, for example, in December in Miami. I wonder, maybe you're not so sort of revolted as I am about this topic, but I just don't know. I just feel like, again, this acceleration just showed that this all needs to change, and it needs to change pretty drastically. But to be frank, I don't know how I see Milan next year. I really don't know how I see Milan next year. Like, what is Milan going to be? Are we still going to go to the fair and sort of like walk for a day and a half to look at 350,000 couches? Like, how is that going to look like,
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, I do not question that these events will continue to happen. Because as a species, this is how we're
Right.
this is how we're wired. Also, B, there are too many vested interests, that really rely on this. I mean, and by vested, I don't necessarily mean in a negative or nefarious sense. I mean, entire economies still rely on this, and unless there are major changes to the economic model, or the fall of capitalism, or whatever, these kinds of events will continue, as I think they should. Now, that doesn't mean that all events were equal before, right? Or were of equal quality and value. So some won't survive. Some won't reappear after this is all over, and maybe that's okay. The strong ones will continue, and we'll also see new ones emerge, and certainly for a while. They will probably be a little more regionally focused, than they were, and again, maybe that's not a bad thing. You were talking about designers and how this pandemic has affected their design process in terms of not being close to the makers or production and so on and so forth. I mean, I know of designers now who are kind of suddenly rediscovering these sort of local craftsmen or local factories that that they'd forgotten about or didn't know about before. And so maybe this is and of course this was being this kind of more localized production was being advocated way before the pandemic, and hopefully this is one of those good accelerations. So I wouldn't I don't want to underestimate the seriousness of the pandemic, but I don't think we should overestimate it either. And we also shouldn't, for better or worse, overestimate how deeply entrenched the systems were that we are now kind of reflecting upon, and also, frankly, how deeply embedded amnesia is with
true,
as well. I mean,
maybe in 1 year we're just again in Barbasso and we won't remember any of this. Well, who knows? Well, I have a couple of questions before we finish our conversation. I think my first one is more related to this idea of constraints, right? We both know that the design process needs constraints, right? And many times the best outcomes of any design process arise from a situation where we have very clear and very strong and a lot of constraints, right? And this is one of those moments, really. So I feel like one can only be hopeful, because I feel like, yes, we've all sort of like mentally been run by a truck in the last 7 months, and we're all just kind of like, what is going on? But I feel like whatever comes out of that process can only be good, because we've been sort of like pushed into a set of constraints that we've never experienced before, and at all levels. And that can only have a good outcome. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, like really, if you look, historically, some of the best work has always emerged. Whether you're talking about art, design, performance, music, so some of the best work has often emerged from the most difficult circumstances. It's in trying times, whether you're talking about constraints or other kinds of pressures. It's trying times that I think really. They bring out the worst in humanity, but they also bring out the best, and that includes cultural and creative creative production. So I'm actually, looking forward to this all being over, not just because it'll be over, but to seeing how things will be different and hopefully better.
Mm-hmm. On the other hand, these kinds of regionalisms that you were alluding to, sort of how that are a little bit connected to this idea of the timeline of the pandemic. I mean, we see things happening now in Shanghai that we cannot imagine putting together right now here in Europe, and much less in certain parts of the United States, right? I think, like you say, on the one hand, I'm hoping for a kind of a real decentering of design discourse to really happen. I mean, to a certain extent, it has been happening already, but I feel like this might be the moment where the sort of like Western Europe, North American stronghold on design discourse really shatters, and we start really seeing a lot of much more importance given to other parts of the world and other discourses. Do you have that impression, or not really? I mean, you have such a good vision of the whole global design discourse that I wonder what your opinion on that is.
Yeah, I mean, this is coming from you as a European, living in Switzerland. I wouldn't worry so much about that, like in terms of losing your advantage.
I would advocate that that's a good thing, like if we all just start looking at somewhere else, like that sort of the North America, Western Europe regions lose this stronghold. I think that's a good thing. No, I mean, we need to open up the canon to other voices, other narratives, other parts of the world, other ideas of what design can be. I mean, they can only enrich the discipline, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think for sure the world, design discourse and cultural discourse has been moving in a more pluralistic direction for a while, and hopefully that's, that will continue, because it allows for a much more sort of diverse, field of voices, right? And everyone benefits from that. The only hesitation, or the only kind of hesitation I have now, is that you can't separate this from the sort of geopolitical mess that that is sort of both sort of tightening and unraveling at the same time right now. And so I think for sure one can't talk about things as singular anymore, right? Like everything is now plural. It's not design history, it's design histories. It's not design discourse, it's design discourses. And in the positive sense, that reflects the pluralism. In the dangerous sense, it could lead to a kind of fracturing and isolationism that I think we need to be always sort of cognizant of. Now, I think you had mentioned in your email, what sort of design over here looks like right now, and I have to say that it is really fascinating, because design is sort of taking different forms, emerging from this different context, and the question for me is how the kind of different languages that are being developed both here and elsewhere will be able to talk to each other, especially at a time when talking to one another is sort of somehow out of fashion. I mean, when you talk about design in the Design Miami Basel sense, like there's I mean, but the ideas and work coming out of Europe are still so strong. I mean, there's such a sort of theoretical, conceptual craft basis for that. I mean, I mean, it's unparalleled. In China, I think there is growing interest in that, but in some ways, there was this notion of leapfrogging that was introduced, or that started being talked about around 10 years ago, where the idea was China would sort of leapfrog the kind of industrial design Bauhaus kind of moment into the kind of post-digital or the digital and post-digital modes of design. And I'm actually just to give you an example. On Thursday, I'm going for the first time to Shang'an, which is the kind of the new. Well, it's an existing agglomeration of about 60 villages, but it's being transformed into what's being framed as a new city being built from scratch. That I think there are already 500,000 people there. Oh, wow. It's meant to eventually house, I forgot, several million people. And it's part of a broader multinodal urban agglomeration that will eventually include Beijing, Tianjin, and this part of Hebei province, which is surrounds Beijing, which I think is meant to be home to a total of 60 or 70 million people eventually. So I'm going to Shanghai for the first time. And this is where a lot of new models of urbanism are being tested out. So, all the smart city stuff. There are a lot of autonomous vehicles in the central core. Everything's facial recognition. That's how you get into your hotel room. So I hear. They have supermarkets there that are unmanned. Oh, wow. So, in some ways, this is where a lot of the resources for design are being channeled in China. The college where I teach at Tongji University is called the College of Design and Innovation, and a lot of the research is focused in sort of the AI, machine learning, and an Internet of Things direction. And what I've started to notice at my school, but also more generally, is that a lot of these technologies and how we interface with them are at this point almost taken for granted. And what you're starting to see more of in China, which I find reassuring, is you do see more of a conversation about the kind of ethical and other implications of these of what's happening. And I think when I talked about design earlier as also being a value system, my hope is that that will increasingly translate here as well.
No, that sounds very interesting, and I feel like people. I mean, exactly. Like it would be great to know. I feel those stories, for example, don't get that much airtime. On a sort of Western Europe, North American design media perspective, right? And I feel like that your call for plurality also should be sort of a mandate that these kinds of institutions, not just educational institutions, museums and other cultural institutions, but also the media has to sort of take on. But I would guess that's a conversation for another time, because I could talk about that for another hour and a half, I would say. But we should come to a close here, and so I kind of wanted to just bring it back to the Swiss Design Awards, which is where we arrived. I mean, this is an initiative that's been going on for a century. It's a federal initiative to sort of support a discipline. I would say it's kind of remarkable that it's been happening for such a long time in the center of Europe, but this is why, again, Central Europe has such a stronghold on, let's say, the design, just the overarching design narrative of our world. I feel like designers, or young designers especially, who usually apply for the Swiss Design Awards and submit their work, they might be pushed by this pandemic to sort of try different things. I hope they will try different things and go in different directions. It's kind of a very stupid question, really, but it's a very basic one, and I think also an important one. What do you think these designers should take away from this whole situation? I feel like we have talked about many of those things, but I wonder if you have like one good advice for them, what that would be.
Keep the faith.
Very good advice, I would say.
I mean, design is design is inherently an optimistic endeavor, right? It's always based on the idea that things can be made better, however one defines better, and it is an act of faith when one engages with design. So, yeah, like I said earlier, I think the way designers are trained equips them well, for adapting to what's to come. I mean, that's what they've been trained for, So, so I think they're as well prepared as anyone.
Very good. And with this, I would like to thank you very much, Aric, for taking the time to talk to me. Yes, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Vera. Hope to see you in real life soon.
Oh gosh, please, yes.